Hey, everybody, and welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, the podcast where we will speak two at the most three and you will seek to interpret. I'm Troy, one of the co-hosts and producers of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, and next to me in the virtual space, as usual, is the ever beautiful and wonderful Brian McDowell. And for us, it's good morning, Brian. How are you?
It's good. I haven't been called beautiful in a while, so that was charming. I liked it. Thank
You
you,
haven't been
Troy.
called a big, beautiful Brian? A big, beautiful Brian?
You have been perfecting your Trump, so
It's funny
I
because
am
I
loving.
can't hear it. For me, I just don't. I think I sound like Jimmy Kimmel or no, what's his name? Jimmy Fallon. No, yeah, Jimmy Fallon trying to do Trump. That's what I think I sound like. But anyway,
No,
all
it's
good.
good. I'm loving the evolution. So well done.
Thank you.
So today we've got a guest on the podcast, and that is someone who plays in the same space as us, who looks into research, though, so, smarter than us, smarter than you and I, Troy, into high control groups and cults, and that's Sarah Steele. So Sarah is the host and creator of the award-winning podcast, Let's Talk About Sects, where she takes a deep dive into the history, leaders, recruitment, and psychological aspects of different cults in each meticulously researched episode. That's meticulously. And I know I do agree. When we listen to it, you do really dive in deep into the space that you research, Sarah. And we are going to talk more about that. But also beyond the podcast, Sarah is an author of a book, Do As I Say, which explores cults, charisma, coercive control, and their impact on our communities. Her work provides a crucial platform for survivors to share their stories, helps to destigmatize the experience of those who've been involved in cults, sheds light on how easily individuals like Troy and I can fall under the sway of leaders who compromise their ethics and morals. So, Sarah, welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we did a panel with Sarah at a conference recently. We were privileged to be on the same panel, and it was from there that we went, hey, you should come on the podcast. So we're rapt that you've come on the podcast. Now, we've got to actually ask you about your fundy cred first, Sarah. So were you a teenage fundamentalist?
I was not a teenage fundamentalist. I have zero fundy cred, I'm afraid.
Hey, that's okay. You can still be on the podcast. We are going to make an exception today because you may not have your own fundy cred, but you are a bit of an expert in this space, and that's what we want to talk to you about today.
Yeah, it's good to have people that are on the outside, isn't it? Who actually look in. And so, it's not about, were you or weren't you a teenage fundamentalist? Although it is the question that we ask everyone. But we are huge fans of your pod. Let's talk about sects. And let's just be clear, it's SECTS. So what you did there, by the way. So for our audience who might not be familiar with your work, and we totally are, well, before we got on that panel with you, could you start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and what led you to create Let's Talk About Sects?
And good pronunciation there, Troy. I've been interviewed by ABC journos who have less good pronunciation than that. It's a really tricky one. It was a great idea at the time, but I've thrown a curveball to a lot of people with that title. My background, it's. I honestly look back at when I decided to start my podcast and think, what was I thinking? Like, why did I think that I would be a good person to do this? Because it was really just out of an interest in the social and cultural aspects that create these groups that, I wanted to learn more about them. And at the time, there weren't any other podcasts about cults, which is wild because there are so many now. And I don't know why I thought I would be a good person to do it, but I guess in hindsight, I'm very glad that I did because the feedback that I've had over the years has been really positive, and I think that it has hopefully been able to feed into those aims that Brian mentioned in the intro, which are really about destigmatizing people who've come out of groups like that and helping people understand that this isn't just like, oh, some group of weirdos in this commune. This is like a really common experience, and there is serious trauma being experienced by people in our society, and they could just be someone who you live next door to. They could be a fellow student at university. And so, I think I started the podcast out of an interest, and what's kept it going is much more to do with discovering this like social justice issue that was just so much bigger than I ever expected at the beginning.
Was there an initial trigger? Was there something that made you go, oh, this is something that I want to do? But, beyond just a sort of a general interest, where did it all start for you?
A drunken conversation with a friend at a party. We thought we'd do this podcast together. We were listening to a lot of true crime at the time, and a lot of other podcasts. It was just when I was starting to get into podcasts. And I always had a short film that I was making on the side. Like my background is filmmaking. So a podcast actually just seemed like something that I could do without having to get a whole film crew together. And I'm a bit of a doer, so when it came around to kind of getting the idea together and like hammering out what it should be, and then I put it in front of my friend, and she totally freaked out. She's like, absolutely can't do this." And I thought, well, I guess I'll just give it a go by myself. And so, as you know, it's quite different to your podcast, which is conversational. And even sitting here with you now, it's like, it's so nice just to have someone to bounce ideas around with rather than sitting in a room and doing it all by yourself. But I think it probably suits me well to just sit down and do a bunch of research and then kind of narrate an episode.
You've done 7 seasons, Sarah. I mean, is that something you ever thought that you would do? Because I know that when we started, we were like, we'll just throw a hat in the ring and see what happens. But you've covered a vast array of different cults and different topics. How do you choose the ones that you're going to cover?
I absolutely did not think that I would still be doing this some kind of 7 or 8 years later. When I started, a question that people asked me a lot was, when are you going to run out of cults to cover? And it's become so clear to me that I could do this for the rest of my life and I would never run out of cults to cover.
Isn't that a funny thing to say? You probably never thought you'd ever hear yourself say, I'll never run out of cults.
Oh, it's a depressing thing to say, to be honest. Like, I wish that it were true, that it was just, Jonestown and the Branch Davidians and a couple of other ones you've heard of, and it turns out to be something else entirely. And so, yeah, I mean, in the beginning, I was definitely trying to do a mix of the better known organizations that people had come across and ones that were flying under the radar to sort of mix in and show the ways that this is actually a much more common experience than you might think. But over time, honestly, like mostly how I select the episodes these days is someone will come to me and say, I've got this experience. I really want to talk about it. And if it turns out that they have, having a first person experience is really what makes people able to properly empathize with what happens in these organizations. So if I can speak to someone who has that experience and they're happy to speak about it, which of course is not everybody, and I would never want someone to speak about it who isn't ready to do so, that tends to be the best approach. And so these days I do a bit more of a mix of the heavily researched kind of standalone episodes and interview episodes as well, because, well, that's mainly because I've realized that in order for it to be sustainable, I can't do quite as many of the heavily researched episodes as I could in the beginning because it is so much work.
So how do you choose the groups then? Is it that people bring ideas to you, people reach out to you, you read the Woman's Weekly, something comes up? How does it happen?
Yeah, honestly, like these days, most of the time I'll get an email from someone who says, I came out of this group, or, could you look into this one? I have a friend who's ended up in it. I do have a list. I've got like a spreadsheet that I've had going since the beginning of the podcast, which has a number of groups that I'm really so keen to look into at some point. I recently did an episode about Falun Gong, and that had been on my list for such a long time. But I went to the Decult conference in Christchurch last year, and through that, I came across a former member of Falun Gong who, Jayamangalam Gibson, who was really happy to speak about his experiences. And he'd been involved kind of with the Epoch Times and all of these different aspects of that group. And so those connections can then be formed through the work, and that might be how I do an episode. But most often it's someone's just got in touch with me and said they've got an experience and they're really ready to talk about it.
You talked just before about the research and the reason that you've now flipped to some interviews because of the depth or the time-consuming nature of the research ones. Talk us through, what's it look like? So you've come across a topic. What happens next in your preparation for one of those research episodes?
Well, I guess I'll open up a few tabs on my browser, and I will first of all, try and ascertain, if I haven't heard of the organization, I'll try and ascertain whether it really is a cultic group. And so I am fairly careful about, how I use the word cult and what I use the word cult for. Um, I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of people who are kind of like, oh, all religions are cults, which I would disagree with, and other people who say, oh, I don't know, some exercise group I was a part of was a cult or whatever it is. And I think actually, or the word cult, is it even useful? It's a pejorative term. We shouldn't be using it. To my mind, we should be using it because it is a pejorative term, because what we're talking about is a very bad thing. And so first up, I'm kind of looking to see if the experiences are sort of corroborated by other people to show that there is actually a problematic element of coercive control in a group. So it kind of fits with the podcast's aims. But then honestly, I mean, I'm looking for details of other former member experiences. I might be reading, 50 pages of a message board where people have been kind of swapping messages about a group and their experiences with it. It could be that I'm listening to other podcasts where people have appeared. There's a lot of the time I'm relying on the work of other journalists who have done a lot of really good investigative journalism, and I'll make sure that I'm, citing those as accurately as possible when I'm writing a script. But what happens is essentially I have so many tabs open that I can barely see the tabs anymore, and that's like my most stressful part of the research. And then by the end, what I want to feel is if I open a tab and there's an article about the group and I read the article, I know everything that article has said because I've already put that into my script, and I am really aware of all of the major problems and all of the major themes going through that group. So the process is slowly starting to close all those tabs down. And like any one of those tabs might send me on another like rabbit hole to kind of read about some particular aspect of a group or the way that it crosses over with another group. So it's just like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's it turns into a bit of a vortex, and then I kind of bring it all back in again by the end.
And it obviously works for you, for sure. Look, coming back to what you were saying before about using the word cult as opposed to sect, as opposed to high control group, as opposed to new religious movement. As you know, I spent some time in what I think is really, except for people in the group, no one's going to argue that it was a cult, called the Revival Centers. And even Tom Tilley, who wrote a book called Speaking in Tongues about the groups that we were in, he doesn't like to use the word cult, and he likes to use the word sect. And I look at that and I think, and I'm not saying this is true of Tom, but of others, where I think it is quite clear that people don't want to use that word because, like you said, it's pejorative and what it says about themselves. And a lot of times people look at that term and they don't want to use it, for a myriad of reasons. And it's really quite politically charged. You know what I mean? It's really quite loaded. And so when I hear you say that about being sure about how to use the word cult and when to use the word cult, it sounds like you've really nailed your colours to the mast in that sense. You're on sort of this side of the fence where also Brian and I live. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because if everything's a cult, then nothing's a cult. And yet what word do we use to describe these sort of destructive groups? And so, yeah, it's tough. But that leads me to this question, which I'm going a little bit off script. Some groups are very litigious, right? And so there's groups like Scientology and who we just don't go near because if we do, they're just going to make your life a living hell. Have you hit on groups where you've just gone, you know what? Sorry, not going there.
Yeah, good question. And Scientology was on that list for me for a really long time. But I did recently do an interview with a former Scientologist. And, I think if someone can speak really clearly to their own personal experiences, it's not my job to censor that, I suppose. But you do have to be really careful. And that's a thing I've thought about since the very beginning. Australia is often known as the defamation capital of the world. So we have changed the law recently around media and defamation slightly, but it's always a risk. And so I can understand why people don't use the word cult if they're worried about litigation or, as you mentioned, because of that stigma that's involved with it. And I don't blame someone who's come out of a group like that for wanting to avoid that word, because I think that often the media depictions of cults, or, you know, fictional depictions, for instance, but often the mainstream media too, they're just covering these really sensationalist groups. You've got like all the sex cults and all of these things. And so people think that a cult is a certain thing, when actually, when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about a group that utilizes coercive control over its members. And so I am often speaking with academics who much prefer to use the word new religious movement, the words new religious movement. That doesn't work for me at all, because many of the groups that I look at aren't even religious. They don't have a religious element. So what is the word that we use to describe a group that's using coercive control in this destructive way, that's causing the types of trauma that we see from people coming out of these organizations? I mean, call it whatever you like, call it a banana, but like, the word is cult.
Well, there's plenty of them. There's definitely plenty of them about. Do any surprise you? Do you start off, because obviously there's similarities and there's universal rules within them. I think the way that they use their high control tactics, there's probably patterns that you could speak to. But what's it look like when you go into them? Do you think, yeah, they're all going to be the same? Or do you get in there and go, wow, these guys have absolutely nailed this, and they've gone the extra step, and that's how they're so good at this?
A bit of both, I'd say. I don't really ever expect them to be all the same, but I do see a lot of similarities. And I am often like really taken aback by the ways that a group will find to get their members to kind of turn everything in on themselves. And so you can do that through a religious belief system, or you can do it through a self-help belief system, or you can do it through, you know, whatever the belief system is, the multi-level marketing cults. Like, it just is.
Political cults, right? There's political
Yes.
cults.
Yes. And so I think that's the thing that often I'm trying to kind of demonstrate, is that it's not really about the belief system itself. It's about the coercion and the control. But also, like, for people who think that they would never end up in a cult, and people say that to me all the time, I would say you just haven't come across the cult that would have got you, because it's all it is coming across a group at a particular point in your life. It's not always vulnerable people, it's people at vulnerable points in their life, right? And so if I'd have come across like one of these socialist cults when I was kind of in my early 20s and you know, really politically involved, easily could have fallen into one of these. And so there was a group that I looked at in Canada that the leader kind of, he was and is a man of color. And so a lot of the women who were white women involved in this socialist organization were kind of shown to turn everything in on themselves, because they were being very careful about privilege and, you know, like, not trying to use their white privilege. And so, like, there are just so many different ways that you can get people to undermine their own sense of their own authority over their lives. And they have really good intentions, as you will have seen in a religious context. You know, you're trying to live well for God or whatever it is, and trying to improve yourself, and everything just ends up coming back in on yourself. And so that's the thing that does surprise me sometimes, is looking in on them and figuring out, oh, they've used this method to try and get people to blame themselves for everything that goes wrong in their life.
Yeah. Is there a secret sauce, though? Is there something that you look and they're all using the same base ingredients, and obviously they've all got their own little idiosyncrasies that they use. But what are some of those core ingredients that you see in just about every one of your topics you research?
So I guess it's just the methods of coercive control. And I think the way to get people to understand this most easily is to compare it to a domestic abuse relationship, because you see really similar methods of coercive control that happen in a one-on-one domestic abuse relationship as happen in a cult, as then actually on a broader scale happen in a kind of a totalitarian government. So you're seeing things like, Oh, control over the types of materials that people can read, or, you know, the media that they can consume, or their communication. Or there are often, well, there's pretty much always, like, keeping people so busy and so involved with the group at every minute that they're not doing other things in life. I mean, sometimes it is their entire life, but sometimes you've got a regular job and it's just every moment that you're not at work or whatever. Like, there could be control over diet and control over hours of sleep and the amount of work that has to be put into an organization, like all of the things that make you so heavily invested in a group that I guess you almost can't, like, really, it's about dulling your critical faculties. You're so invested and so involved and so kind of um not at a point that you can step back and really think about what's going on and whether it's the right thing for you.
So
But
busy, so busy
busy,
with
yeah,
it all.
keeping you just
Yeah, and
so busy,
engulfed. Yeah,
totally
yeah.
engulfed. Yeah, that's right. But I mean, there are so many other aspects as well. So I think that the secret sauce often it is kind of around the, and I don't even want to say that it's the charismatic leader, because now I've looked at so many groups where, you know, maybe there was an initial charismatic leader, but it's actually passed on into the group, and the group is even like self-policing to kind of fit into this belief system. But often in the beginning, it is about the charisma of the person who started it, because if that person has hit on something that gets people to follow them, and that person is a very, like, happy to exploit others and probably has no ability to empathize, and, you know, it's all about power and control for them, and often they've tried a few different things before they hit on the thing that works for them. Like, you do have much smaller groups where there is maybe a bit of a lack of charisma, but they do have control over, I don't know, it could be as few as, it could be just one family. Like, there are family cults that exist, but the ones that really grow big, it's often because there is that charisma, as well as whatever the belief system that they've managed to get people to pay into.
Do you think that these leaders arrive at this through trial and error, or do they do a course somewhere on YouTube? Like, how do they find this? Because I know a lot of people are going to say, you know, the group that I was in, for example, you know, I'm being someone else here, role playing, folks. The group that I was in, he just wasn't that smart, or she wasn't that smart. You know, this wasn't intentional, or their heart was in the right place. How do all these groups sort of end up in the same place?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think that it does vary from group to group. I've definitely researched leaders who it seems have intentionally learned from other groups. And you can see where there are people who have come out of Scientology, for instance, or had dealings with the Children of God, who have then gone on to create their own organization. I see that all the time. But this is why I think it's quite useful to look at how the similarities are there with domestic abuse relationships, because a lot of the time, those coercive control behaviors, they're almost like just an extension of human relationship and the ways that we deal with each other in day-to-day life. Like, every one of us is capable of using methods of coercive control over other people. And I think it's actually on every single one of us to be aware of those methods and make sure that we're not using them in our relationships and in our lives. But because you see those things almost when you get a certain combination of people, whether it's a one-on-one relationship or a cultic group, um, they are recruiting people who are, you know, very ready to give of themselves to the group. And that's kind of one of the things that you see in cults that I just think, oh, there's so much goodness in the people involved who are, they're so generous and they're so idealistic and they really want to contribute to something bigger than themselves. And it's like such a waste of human potential that what they're contributing to is a group that's really taking advantage of them. It's like that could be used so effectively in a group that is genuinely trying to do good in the world and in society. So I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's just, I think that it is, you if you're looking at cultic groups and kind of like banning one group or targeting one group, like, another one's just going to pop up that's using the same behaviors, because these are just, they're human behaviors. When you get a certain type of person at the top of a group who is recruiting a certain type of person underneath them, who or at a certain point in their life, that could be any one of us, you're going to end up with groups that have these behaviors. And so I guess the impression of a member might be that the person at the top was doing it accidentally or didn't really know what they were doing or had the best of intentions. But as soon as you're using those methods of coercive control, like, you have had people come to you and say that there is a problem. You have seen people who have been damaged by this process. And if your response to that is to boot that person out and tell everyone that they can't talk to them anymore and they can't hear about any of the problems that they were raising, you are doing something intentional there. You're not learning from any of the issues in your group. You're not listening to the people who you're harming. And so if a group really is cultic, I think whether or not the intention was there from the beginning, it's the response to the problems people are raising that is the issue. A group that is using problematic behaviors, when they're raised, is going to figure out how to make things better rather than just like getting rid of those people and continuing to make things worse.
I've never heard anyone put it like that before, and I've been playing in this cult space for however many years. So if we're on Teams, I'd put a little applause up for that. That was really, really good, because I've never really thought about that, yeah, they might have got there by accident, or they might have actually stumbled across these tactics. But the fact that so many people have pointed out to them that this is damaging and they're doing nothing about it just puts the responsibility straight back on the leaders. So yeah, well said.
Thanks.
Talking about the damaging aspects of it, I mean, obviously we see, this is dealing with vulnerability in humans. You speak to a lot of people that are involved in a range of different sects or cults. What does it do to people, particularly around their identity, their sense of autonomy, their ability to critically think, and obviously self-doubt? Like, you're going to be questioning yourself. What are some of those things that you see in people?
Oh, yeah, it's a really important thing to think about, because I think a lot of the time when the general public thinks about cults, they think, oh, why didn't you just leave? Or like, someone gets out of a group and hooray, they're free. And it's like, actually, there's a load of ongoing ramifications for that person, for their life, and for society in general, which is another reason we should be doing something more about this problem. But I mean, it depends a lot on the group itself, how long the person was involved, whether they were born in or whether they joined. Like, there are a lot of different factors. But obviously, I think most of us can imagine that if you've devoted kind of all of the spare minutes of your life for a number of years to an organization that you believed was one thing, and then you come out and find out that it was actually something else entirely, and you feel potentially, and not everyone does, but you feel that you wasted those years of your life and all of your passion and all of your dedication. I mean, it's just incredibly destabilizing for a start. It can cause people to really, question their own judgments, to be really resistant to ever joining any kind of group ever again. People have told me that they don't even know what what their favorite color is coming out of certain groups, or they don't even know what they like to wear, because some groups will have a lot of control over the types of clothes that you can wear, and so they don't even know. They're so out of touch with themselves that they don't even know what their own taste is anymore. And then I mean, there's the stigma as well, which is still such a huge problem, because people don't really understand that this isn't just like, oh, you're such a weirdo coming out of a group like this. This is like a very common experience. So you can't really talk about it to a lot of people who really understand what you've been through without kind of facing pretty idiotic questions, to be honest, a lot of the time. And then, there's so many elements. Finding a psychologist who understands enough to help you through that process can be incredibly difficult for people. Like, some of the groups are so extreme that, I've spoken to people who came out and they didn't even know how to open a bank account. They didn't know how to rent a property. And they might have multiple children. And, there can be some really core hierarchy of needs type of things that people actually have to get addressed before they can even move into the psychological aspect of the whole thing. So there's just such a huge amount of needs that these people have that we really could be doing an awful lot better to address. A lot of people say to me, not that it's the same experience, but there are similar needs to someone who is a refugee and has come from a country overseas and has to rebuild their entire life, because often you've lost your entire community if you've come out of a group like this. If you've joined, you might have alienated your family and friends who weren't a part of the organization. And if you were born in, you are literally losing like everybody who is a part of your life when you come out of a group like that. So, I mean, I'm sure you well know, but you can imagine the types of needs that come from that situation.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about people not being able to open bank accounts and etc. How do you respond to that though, when people might look at this and say, because you and I might look at this and say it's a spectrum, right? Like we've got really deep end of cults and shallow end of cults, but they're still on the spectrum. How do you respond to people that say, "Oh, my group wasn't so bad because I'm not like them"? I can open a bank account and my kids are in school and I go to Aldi. How do you respond to that?
I mean, I wouldn't want to undermine anyone's understanding of their own experience in any way. And maybe for them, it isn't that impactful. Maybe that is how they feel. But a lot of the time, that can indicate that someone, I don't know, maybe hasn't fully dealt with the ramifications of what they've been through. Because I think in certain cases, when it wasn't as extreme, it means you think that it's not such a big deal. And over time, it can really come back to bite you, because there are still some really latent issues there in the back of your mind that you haven't really dealt with and you're minimizing because, and again, I think this is down to the media representation of these groups, because I wasn't living on a commune and they didn't control all aspects of my life. So, it's not that bad, but actually being under the coercive control of someone who's kind of making decisions over your life that you should be making for yourself, it really does undermine your own sense of self and who you are. And sometimes some of those things that are a lot more, nuanced or less obvious, they're actually the things that are a lot harder to deal with. If you're not dealing with the immediate needs that someone has who's been in a very extreme group, there's a lot more complex psychology in there that you can push down, but often it will raise its ugly head at some point down the line.
It's really interesting. I think about people who've remained, and some of these are people that haven't necessarily been born into these groups, but certainly were recruited in as teenagers around about the same time that Troy and I were, but are there now. And their ability to question anything is severely low. They see that criticism as something that is wrong. It's not just that, that's not something we do. It is absolutely wrong because you're not trusting the leaders. You're not trusting those people who, I guess, are anointed, usually in the space that we came from, anointed with the truth. And it's a truth that only they can know. And you see it over and over and over. And it's quite disturbing because even those people that I see have come out and they still hold on to that as well, that inability to critically think and question anything. So they still hold on to that leadership.
Or they often become conspiracy theorists too, even though they may have left the group.
Yeah, that's actually what I was just thinking too, is the conspiracy theory stuff is, yeah, it's super interesting because then that's the opposite of the spectrum where it's question everything as well. So everything you see here on the surface isn't real. You got to question it all. And I think we saw an acceleration of that during COVID. Globally, and we're still dealing with the fallout, and we probably will forever. I think it's actually changed humanity. If maybe I don't think that's too big a stretch to say, but I actually do think it has. Are you observing similar things in your research and similar, I guess, aspects of the fallout of COVID?
Yeah, definitely. The conspiracy theory stuff is it's pretty wild. And like a lot of people look at QAnon as if it is a cult in and of itself. And interestingly, the QAnon catchphrase is trust the plan, right? So there is still that element of trust in there. And conspiracy theories are pretty common in cultic groups. So that's across religious groups and non-religious groups. You'll find like a lot of, because people in the groups, the leaders want the followers to trust the group and not the outside world, the secular society or whatever it is, the rest of the society who is unenlightened or whatever it is. They do tend to fall back on conspiracy type tropes, which, if everything you're doing is for this higher purpose and this greater good, that definitely feeds into that you might not particularly need to follow the laws of the society that you live in, or it's okay to lie to people outside the group because it's for the greater good or whatever it is. And so it makes for a lot of, I guess, bad faith conversations, because how can you actually deal with a group that isn't willing to follow the laws that the rest of society, like the social contract? And it's a complicated problem. But I can't remember the first part of what you were saying now. It was,
Look, I've got to be honest, Sarah. Either can I. But I think one of the things that we saw was a really unusual marriage of two people out the other side of COVID, and that was Christians and conspiracy theorists. Because I'm generalising when I say Christians, but particularly evangelicals, Pentecostals, who saw the COVID injection as the mark of the beast. And so you then had the COVID conspiracy theorists coming together, and you've seen this unholy marriage of these two. And I think that's also changed evangelicalism. And I mean, you see this with the cult of Trump, obviously.
I was about
and you
to say
see,
that fed MAGA, didn't it? That marriage.
absolutely. Yeah. So I think that they are things that I think have changed the face of Christianity, or certainly evangelical Christianity, forever. Like, you can't undo that now.
yeah, and it was what you were saying about critical thinking, I think, was the key, because you do have people are set up to just be kind of conditioned to trust that those at the top are saying what to do and you should follow it because there's a higher purpose, and you cannot question it. You just have to trust it. And so it's like, for people like me, it's really hard to get your head around how that could then equate to trusting someone like Donald Trump. Like, that guy? Are you serious? But that's what these people really believe, that basically he was put there by God, and nothing he does can be wrong, even though it might look wrong. And so this critical thinking thing is just like, if we take that away, and so you're absolutely right. You also do see people who actually have come out of cultic groups and then also get involved in the conspiracy movement afterwards. And that, again, is like the critical thinking. It's just, you can kind of understand why they're questioning everything and think that, like, actually, I need to be critical of everything. But those groups have often taught people not to trust the establishment, not to trust the medical establishment, not to trust psychologists. And so we're putting our trust in the wrong places. So, yeah, you can't, there's not really an understanding of scientific method and how it works. And so the people we should be putting our trust in, the experts in various fields, like, yes, always be skeptical. I don't think that that's a bad thing, but I mean, I'm going to trust the people who have spent years creating the vaccine rather than, my dad who tells me not to get it.
Yeah, rather than taking a horse tranquilizer, for sure. It's interesting. Years ago, when I was doing, I realized, by the way, I start every question with "it's interesting," but that's because it's interesting.
Yes.
Some years ago, gosh, it was in the 90s, when I was researching the revival centers, the group that I was in, and I was looking at British Israelism. And British Israelism has very strong ties to white identity movements in the US. And one of the guys who was who was writing about this And back in the 90s, like it's, he saw it coming. And he talked about the cultic mindset is what he called it. And he meant that this distrust of everything, which is what conspiracy theorists basically do, this distrust of everything that is institutionalized. But he called that a cultic mindset because that's basically what they do inside cults. So it's not hard to see how people, like you said, they're conditioned. They have these, these grooves built into their psyche that basically is just waiting for someone to pour the next conspiracy theory down, whether that's religious like British Israelism or whether it's QAnon or whatever it is. So people are sort of prepared, which leads me to what I want to ask you next. And that is, which other groups that you researched specifically identify as Christian? And maybe they started within a sort of a mainstream Christian framework and then became something worse, or maybe they just started off as cultic. Can you talk to us about some of the groups?
Yeah, I mean, I pulled up my episode list just to kind of have a look through, and honestly, like there are so many of these organizations that would identify as Christian, and so you've got, everything from the Children of God to the 12 tribes to, like there are just so many. It's like, and I think that my work is kind of biased in this area because I am an English-speaking person in, a country where Christianity is dominant. So a lot of the offshoots are going to come from a Christian faith system. But I do think like a lot of the groups that come across my desk these days are sort of Pentecostal background. And I guess, yeah, the British Israelism, I hadn't come across that until I researched the revival centers as well. So I wasn't aware of that at all until my interviewee told me about it. And that, like, I mean, this is just another another tangent to kind of go off on, but I think that it is sort of mystifying to a lot of people why there's such a strong support of, or, lack of desire to criticize what is happening in Gaza at the moment, right? And I think that a lot of people don't understand that there's a real kind of evangelical Christian support of what's going on over there, because the Armageddon is going to be precluded by huge amounts of death and destruction in the Middle East. And so this, to a lot of people over there, is just like welcome signs that the Armageddon is coming.
Yeah, it's bring it on. Bring it on. Here comes Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I think, I think a lot of people don't realize where that groundswell is coming from, and that it's a huge amount of it is coming from this evangelical Christian movement in the United States at the moment.
It truly is frightening. And people are encouraging it because they want the end to come. They want Jesus to return. They want Armageddon. People are just in a blind bind around it. It's fascinating, but I haven't thought about it too much because sometimes it can be, it etches something up from the back of your mind. You go, is some of that true? Like a lot of the stuff's happening here, particularly when, like we were talking about this week, when Trump gets called, a great man of peace. And everything we learned about the Antichrist was it's a guy who will come in as the great bringer of peace. And we know he's anything but, besides the dropping the bombs, I mean, everything he does is to undermine and get people to actually be at war with each other within the world, but particularly within the states. That's how he's created the instability which ushered him in as president.
But that shows, Brian, that, that sort of deep indoctrination in us. Of course, the thought comes and the thought goes for us now because we've left. But for others, the thought comes and the thought stays. But it was me that actually said that because I heard the head of NATO calling Trump a man of peace. And I think that's actually the biblical term is for the Antichrist is the man of peace. And I just went, well, that's it. Here's the Antichrist. There we go. But I can remember sitting on a couch with my, then girlfriend, eventually becomes my Christian wife, watching when Tony Blair got nominated to some position in the United Nations. And we both turned to each other and said, is he the Antichrist? Because we're just constantly, hypervigilant for who's the Antichrist. And look, Sarah, it's funny because when we admit this stuff to people who were never in it, which is, I know Brian's probably thinking the same thing. It's like, but I promise we're not that bad now. But yet we were. We used to hear voices in our heads that, were our own thoughts and say it was Jesus telling us things. And that's just the way it is. But hey, just coming back to this, question about the Christian groups, is there anything particularly striking about the Christian groups? Is there anything that sort of stands out to you? More controlling, less controlling, or is it just the same as everyone else, just with a different label?
I mean, it's a difficult question. I mean, they're really all quite different from each other, but then a lot of them do have a lot of similarities as well, which is what I said earlier. But I guess for me, I mean, I think that this probably makes me sound incredibly naive, but it just always surprises me as someone who was not brought up to be religious, that you can use this Christian belief system in such a negative way, because I always had this impression, and a lot of former fundamentalists and other Christians would say that this is just, as I say, incredibly naive, because I think you can be a Christian and be a bad person, and it's not unchristian, because a lot of what some terrible people do in life can be justified by certain readings in the Bible. And so thinking of Christians as being, do unto others and actually really wonderful, well, those are a lot of the Christians that I've met, and they really are wonderful people, but that's actually it's not an accurate depiction of all Christians. It just is a naive perception of like, how can these groups be basing their teachings on the Bible and yet be so toxic and horrible? It's like, because there are justifications that they can find in the Bible to behave like that. And so my actual biblical understanding is very, very basic. It's not at all comprehensive. But I guess that's the real kind of eye-opener for me, because if you look at a group like the Children of God, for instance, that came from a Christian belief system, and that leader, David Berg, I don't know if this needs a content warning or something, but he managed to create a justification for essentially child sexual abuse from a biblical background. And so I think that his beliefs would be quite difficult to justify from text in the Bible itself. But that was a Christian belief system, and that came from a Christian belief system. And, he had many followers who managed to believe.
Yeah, he came out of the Jesus People movement, which is where Keith Green and, Jesus People USA and all those came from as well. So, yeah, it's sort of that hippie 70s, early 70s kind of Christian groups for sure.
The Bible's not a nice book. I mean, it's full of genocide, infanticide. It's full of treating people in the most horrible of ways, and you've got to actually sort through it to pull out some of the good stuff. And it's the good stuff that you would hear. I mean, we would hear sermons week after week after week that really use the same theme. There was, a common group of scriptures that would be used about love, another one about community or whatever, but no one would ever preach on the undesirable scriptures, those ones that you kept buried away. You'd always highlight the good stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And I wanted to touch on what you just said before, Troy, as well, about how you would be looking out for the Antichrist. And, like to someone like me, that would sound so crazy. I just think that stuff is actually really important for people like me to understand the mindset of someone who is entwined in a group like this, because there is such a heightened sense of everything at all times. And if you're thinking that Jesus is giving you these messages and that you're always looking out for the Antichrist and the Armageddon is on its way, like, I think that those of us who don't have any experience with that kind of belief system, it's very useful to try to understand what that mindset is like, because it's a completely different way of looking at the world. And even thinking about, I was talking to another interviewee about this recently, which is just that everything that you're doing on this earth is really about the afterlife and about heaven or whatever it is after this life. It's like, to my mind, this life right now is all that I've got, and I want to do like anything good that I can in this life because there's nothing afterwards. And so even the concept that actually nothing that you do in this world has any consequences, if that's shaping the way that you behave and the things that you do in life, like, it's really important to understand that mindset, even if it is something that you can't identify with.
I think I almost said it then. I almost said it's interesting.
It's interesting.
Because it is. Fuck. That's why we do this pod. That's why we've got you on the show, Sarah, because it's goddamn interesting. What I find fascinating is when we were in the groups, and I think this is oftentimes, look, yeah, it's mentioned, and you can read all the cult books, and you can read the, Margaret Singer's stuff and Yanya Lalek's stuff, and it says it, but I don't think people realize how, people on the outside anyway, how all encompassing this is. And when you are in the middle of it, your entire world. Sarah, I missed world events when I was in the Assemblies of God, which is, not a cult in air quotes. I'm going to argue that. But I missed world events because I was at prayer meetings, because I was interpreting everything, like we're watching the news and Tony Blair gets nominated to some position in the UN or whatever it was back then. And we're asking, is it the Antichrist? We're not worried about what's that going to mean for Darfur or anything like that. We're asking this, everything. And what that does, and I see the fallout of this in some of the people that we go to meetups and we see in our Facebook group, etc. These people and us at the time, so hypervigilant and so on edge all the time because you're living in this world where everything is coming to this head, but also you're under this pressure to be the best you can because we're living in the last days, etc. But it's so all-encompassing. And so even though you can step away, right, you could just walk away and no one's going to stop you, but you don't because it's a prison of the mind, right? There's so many reasons why you need to stay. I don't know. I just think that in itself, whether that actually meets the criteria for coercive control or not, it still has such a profound effect on people psychologically, even physically, right? Because we know the body keeps the score. And yeah, look, I'll stop there, but that's really something that I think I carried for the longest time. And that sort of did some deep, deep damage to me, to my psyche and, dare I say, to my soul.
Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine it. Like, yeah, you just described it so well, but it's like I can't even get my head into that space. But yeah.
Don't, Sarah. Don't get your head into the space. It's something that we've spent years trying to undo. So there's a lot of people in our group, and I think Troy and I went through this as well. That when we left, we were like, we weren't in a cult. We weren't. Maybe we were just in something that was cult-like. We used to say that it was almost like cult adjacent, but it wasn't a cult. And there's a lot of people, I think, that will land in a place where they go, okay, I was part of a high control group. And that's okay, because that's incredibly dangerous too. When you're looking at researching one of these, you said before that people come to you and go, hey, you should look into this. What are some of those determining factors or identifiers that you look for that does say this is a sect, this is a high control group?
I mean, it is mainly looking at commonalities in the experiences of former members. Like, are there a number of people who have been through this organization who are sharing experiences that indicate a level of coercive control? That, like, have they been shunned when they left? Were all their relationships with people in the group completely broken down? What was the attitude that they were encouraged to have towards those outside the group? Were their relationship options limited to people within the group or people who they could bring into the group? I mean, so many different indicators like that. But that's not to say, I mean, I have research groups where the only person I knew who had the personal experience was the person that I was speaking to. And so I guess, yeah, like you say, if someone's come out of a group that they don't believe is necessarily a cult, but has cultic aspects to it, it can still have those same damaging things. And those are things that we should be talking about. And so I was speaking to a couple of former members of the Geelong Revival Centre who have helped get this Victorian inquiry up that's happening at the moment, the parliamentary inquiry. And I thought it was a really good way to look at it as if you've got a group that is not a cult but still exhibits some of these problematic behaviors, that group should want to improve those things and deal with those things. So I think it's still useful to talk about the behaviors and the issues, and to know that someone who's come out of a group, that whether or not it strictly was a cult, like they can be damaged by those very same behaviors. And so I just think like none of these, like religious organizations in particular, they're likely to look at this inquiry and be a bit worried about what it might mean for them. What it should mean for them is something really good, which is if there are problematic elements that relate to high control and coercive control in your organization, what a great opportunity to address some of these and make sure that your group is not harmful.
Yeah, I like your analogy with family violence as well. That's an area that I work in and spend a lot of time in, and we work with a lot of people who use different mechanisms of family violence, whether that be coercive control or physical violence. Many different aspects of it. And quite often it is things that have been generationally passed down and people don't even understand they're doing it. So quite often they're usually court ordered to come to us, and we will help them understand how they've got to there. And, we'll look at, hey, how were you brought up? What was your family unit like? What was your um, thinking around A, B, and C? And quite often, light bulbs go on for people and they go, I've never thought about it that way. And people then come to a juncture where it's either I'm going to, I'm going to consciously change my ways. And that can be many years of a journey because people will fall back into their ways, or they'll choose to go, actually, this has worked for me and I don't care about the impact on anyone else. I'm going to keep doing it that way. And I think we see this. We see these parallels with churches. And I think that's why it works so well when we do those comparisons. But I think we saw this with Hillsong too. We saw Hillsong going, well, basically Brian Houston at the start was, denying everything and just going, we're not going to change anything. But then I think we saw the new leadership, at least actually using the words, whether the actions actually met the words, of going, we've seen what's happened here. We've seen the damage of the actions or the inaction, and we're going to change things. Some of that was because there was legislation that was saying you've got to change these things. But I think that some of them were actually going, we've seen the errors of our ways and we've seen the impact of it. But I don't think it happens that often, and it doesn't generally happen voluntarily. I think something has to happen, like a royal commission or a whistleblower or something, to actually get these people to respond.
Yeah, and I think you also have to be careful that it isn't just lip service, because I've also looked at many groups that have said, oh, we're addressing these issues, and it actually is just a bit of a smoke screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it depends how kind of endemic the behaviors are to the organization, because it can take a lot to undo them. But also, like, it's so inspiring to hear you talk about people who didn't understand what they were doing, and that you can kind of show them that it came from a generational kind of background or whatever, and then they do decide to change their ways. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's easy to give up hope and just think that these groups are evil, but I do think there are a number of people in these organizations who don't have a concept of the damage that's being done, and that's important to try and work with those people to improve as well. And fantastic if you can do that.
Yeah.
Another aspect of that is, without blowing too much smoke up our own asses, Brian, but is people like us who came to this and say, nah, I'm not doing that. I could see it would have been quite easy for me to slip into adopting these behaviors in leadership, particularly in the Assemblies of God. I had people that were above me in the hierarchy who were demonstrating these on an extreme level. And if it hadn't been for the blanket of the group that they are under, they could have run off and started, what would have been indisputable cults. But looking at that and saying, no, I'm not going to do that. That's wrong. And then we were forced at the end to make a decision. You either play the game, which is you start, using these methodologies and tactics, or at least not challenging them, or you leave. And so we did. we basically walked away. So I think that, there are, as you know, there's more people that are outside of the cult than are inside the cult usually in terms of the, the revolving door. So most people, I think, are good. Most people actually look at it and go, nah, this is wrong, this is bad, or I can't do this, or, or become militant against it, whatever they do. But most people move through. It's those that stay, and some stay in a victim state and others stay in an aggressor state, but most people leave.
So true. And yeah, I just have so much admiration for people who do come to those realizations and come out themselves, because if you're in that system and you're seeing that behavior and that's demonstrated to you day to day, like, I just think it's amazing that you can sort of say, actually, no, I'm putting my foot down and I will not do that. Like, let me blow a bit of smoke up your ass. Like, I think it's really impressive. And so a thing that I often see with people leaving is that they might have procreated within the group. And so they have a child and they're bringing the child into that system. And that's when they think, actually, I don't think I can put up with this for my child. And so, and I feel exactly the same. I think most people are good. I guess the problem then is that actually the group can just become more and more toxic because the good people are leaving. And so it just becomes even more
It's only the
controlling.
bad blood that's left. All the good blood's moved on. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting when you say, people that procreate within it. I was one of those, and both of my kids were born when I was with my ex-wife, who was a fundie, still is a fundie. That's one of the hardest things about leaving. Like, when you got kids in there, and it's multi-layered as well, because it's just like, am I going to destroy the salvation of my children and, damn them to hell? But also a lot of your support systems, because of all of those tactics we've spoken about that keep you involved in these groups, there's a lot of fear. And it takes a lot of time to actually extract yourself. Some people, there's a cataclysmic event, which means that they have to leave or whatever. But for me, it was over many, many years that things just ebbed away. And the point where I got divorced was when I left, and because it was an easy out. And I wasn't, by that time, I didn't even believe in hell. I didn't believe in, literal resurrection. So there's hardly anything left of the faith that I once
Brian
had.
was a shit Christian from beginning to end, by the way. Let's just be clear on that.
I was horrendous.
Didn't believe a word of it.
I tried, but I wasn't very good. So, but, what are some of those commonalities that you see of all the people that you speak to? The common challenges of leaving these groups. What are those things that you see, and what's some of the advice that you would give people who are experiencing that, given that you've also seen people through the journey of leaving?
Such a huge question, and exactly what you've just said. Like, if you've got family, I know many people stayed in many of these groups, and many people are still in many of these groups because their family is there, and so they don't want to break up their family, the people that they love dearly. But that's a huge complicating factor. And yeah, I mean, as you say, like, there can sometimes be an event that will cause someone to leave, but often it's something that happens over a long time. There's always a bit of cognitive dissonance that's going on, and something will just sort of break through. Like, there's one thing after another, and then the final thing that causes the whole house of cards to tumble down. And it's actually really difficult to give someone advice to leave a cultic group, because everyone I spoke to who's done it, or almost everyone, has said that it was the most difficult thing that they ever did. Now, they don't tend to have regrets about doing it years later, but the path that you're about to go down in leaving is not an easy one, for all of the reasons that we've already mentioned and many more. But that said, I do think if the relationships that you have with people are dependent on you being a member of a certain organization, are they real friendships, I suppose? And if they can just I guess they are real friendships because that person is also kind of tied to the rules of the organization. But I do think that most of the time you will be able to have much more genuine and true friendships and communities outside of that organization, because there's not a risk that you're going to lose them by making this one decision. You're going to find people who are going to stick with you through thick and thin. It will take time and it will be difficult, but in the long run, having agency over your life and your decisions, um, having a freedom that exists outside of a group like that, most of the time is really worth it.
Yeah, agreed. And that's been our experience too. Hey, Sarah, I'm looking at my interview notes here, and we're coming to a stage in the interview notes that's headed wrap up. So let's do that, shall we? For listeners who are interested in learning more about your work, where can they find your pod, your book, and any other resources that you're pushing out?
Yeah, I mean, the podcast, Let's Talk About Sects, is on all of the usual podcast platforms, and the website is ltaspod.com. The book is called Do As I Say, and get it from a library. I'm happy for you to borrow it. I get lending royalties, so that's totally fine.
Is that a thing?
But I want to...
Lending royalties? Wow.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. And, I know not everyone has the money to go and buy a copy of a book, so go and borrow a copy. But it's out in the world, and it is also an audiobook for those who find it difficult to read sometimes, which can sometimes be me. And I think that's the main stuff. Yeah.
Are there any resources that you've come across that have really helped you in your journey of understanding these groups and their effects, that might also help people that have either come out and they're trying to understand and contextualize their experience, or they're maybe listening and they're sitting on the edge of leaving but are fearful? Are there any resources you can think of that you can recommend?
I always refer people to Cult Information and Family Support, CIFS, which is a volunteer organisation in Australia. It's very under-resourced, so anyone who just wants to support those coming out of groups like that, chuck them a donation. They can really use all the help that they can get. There's also another organisation called the Olive Leaf Network, which started in New Zealand and has recently launched in Australia. And they're fantastic for resources. And then there's also the International Cultic Studies Association. They have a lot of resources that you can tap into as well. From my understanding, I mean, it's people like you who shared their personal experiences with me that really helped me to understand the dynamics. And I just give absolutely full credit to the victims and survivors of groups like this.
Yeah, storytelling is just so incredibly powerful. Like, I think that is one of the greatest weapons against these types of groups. And as you said before, you can't deny somebody's experience. I mean, their interpretation of it may be skewed, because I think even when I first came out, my interpretation of it was pretty skewed because it's so loaded with so many different aspects. But I think it's difficult to deny that, and there's a real power in it. So well done. That's why it's so great that you continue to do this work. But what's next for you?
What's next?
Yeah, what's next?
I wish I had an answer for you. I've had a documentary project on the back burner for quite a while now, so I'm hoping to revisit that one sometime soon. The podcast doesn't show any signs of going away, but, in an ideal world, I could retire the podcast because, I don't know, the outcomes of the Victorian inquiry turn out to be cult crushing, and then they're adopted across the country, and then we never have to deal with this problem again. You never know.
No. Can I tell you something? I think I do know. But go on, live the dream.
I mean, I would actually love to retire the podcast, but I'm very happy to keep providing it as a platform for people who want to talk about their experiences. And so it continues, unfortunately, but also hopefully fortunately in some aspects too.
Yeah, well, awesome, Sarah. And now it's our turn to blow smoke. And thank you for what you do. I mentioned to you on the religious trauma panel that we were on that you did that story on the Revival Fellowship, which is a split off from the Revival Centre. Same shit, different bucket. You've also done stuff around, the Geelong Revival Centres, and you were talking about interviewing Ryan and others just recently. So what you do is really important. what happens with a lot of these groups is when ex-members do their thing, yes, there's a power in that, but combined with people that are outside that have never been in it, and especially people that are collecting all the other evidence and slot theirs in amongst all that, actually it's more than subtle for these groups because they can't say, oh, they're just against us. It's like, no, they don't even know you, and yet they're putting that in there. So yeah, kudos to you and thank you very much for what you do.
Thank you. That's incredibly kind. And thank you for what you do too.
Thank yous all round. And thank you for coming on the pod. And I think a lot of people will get much insight into others and also into self from the conversation today. So thanks for sharing, Sarah.
My absolute pleasure.
If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great ex-evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion cost of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Beck Wise. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.